So welcome back to our next video here as part of the entire Module 3 discussion that we're having here. So in this video, we're going to talk about building a conversational language understanding application and what that is, the underlying technology, and as usual, we'll do a demonstration at the end here, a lab demonstration to show you how to do the complete deployment. So in here, we're going to talk about provisioning an Azure AI language resource. We'll talk about what an intent is, an entity, and what an utterance is. We'll talk about the patterns that you're going to use to differentiate, the different utterances, as well as we're going to use some pre-built entity components, which we'll talk about what those are in our demonstration and our discussion here. We'll talk about once you've set this up, how do you train it? How do you test it? How do you publish it? And then last but not least, how do you actually utilize it within your application? So that's what we're going to be looking at here in this discussion. So the first thing we need to look at is exactly what is language understanding, or more specifically, conversational language understanding. What this is we need some type of technology that allows us to accept a human, the way they speak naturally. What time is it? What time is my flight? What is today's date? How many of this do I need in order to fulfill my requirements? So basic conversations that we're having. So we need a model that can extract the conversational language and then convert it into something that's meaningful and useful within the model, and then provide some type of response. So that's the primary purpose of this. In order to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to use what we refer to as natural language processing. And natural language processing requires a language model to interpret the user's input. Again, that conversation, that natural language that we have in our day-to-day dialogue. Now, in order for this to work, there are some terms that you need to understand and the process, the workflow. And as I mentioned, we're going to do a demonstration on it a little bit later to show you how this actually works in real life, in reality. So there are a couple terms that you need to understand. One of those is utterance, and the other one is intent. Now, what an utterance is basically a question of some sort, or some type of statement that is made by a human, generally, through natural conversation. But we take that utterance and we need to convert that into something that the system can then use to define an answer. That utterance is tied to what we call an intent. And if you look at the example here, an example of an utterance would be, what time is it? And on the back end, the system would say, okay, what you're trying to do is get the time. And then it will process it based off of that and generate a response. Or tell me the time. If you notice here, I've got two different ways of asking the same question, which deals with time. So we need a way to map it back on the back end to something that the model can then provide a response for. In our second example, you'll see, what is the weather forecast? And the intent based on that is, okay, we need to get weather information. So we're going to get the weather. Or, do I need an umbrella? Same thing in this example here. The questions are very different, but they both want the same information, which is in this case to get the weather, and so forth. So that is the purpose. So we have an utterance, which is basically a statement or a question that someone may ask. And then we have the intent, which is basically how do we map it back to the back end to something that the system can process. So those are key things. And in our demonstration, you'll see how that actually works. Now, the next component we have are what's called entities. Now, an entity is an additional component that you can utilize. So we just talked about what an utterance is. An utterance is essentially just a statement or a question that someone makes. The intent is how do we map it back to something that the system can process on the back end. And then finally, we have the entity. Now, the entity is additional data. And essentially what this does is it helps the model better provide a response. So in this example here, if we look at the second question, what time is it in London? Well, we know or the system knows that you're trying to get the time. But here's the thing. I'm asking for the time in a specific location. That is where the entity comes into play. There's an entity tag for location, and in there we're looking for London. And we'll talk about the different types of entities and how we can map those as we continue forward on here. Now, if you look at this one here, well, I need an umbrella tonight. Again, what is the purpose here? The intent is to get the weather. But if you notice here, the entity type in this case is a unit of time. So we're looking for time, and in this case, it's tonight. Or turn the light on. And the intent here is to turn on the device. So in this case, the entity would be a device, and it would be tagged back to light. Now, the purpose of entities is to better help your model train and determine how to better respond. That is the primary purpose of the entities that you have within your system. Now, there are different types of entities that we can have. One of the entities that you can have is an entity that is automatically learned. Another type of entity which you can have is here, which is a pre-built entity. Pre-built entities are predefined by Microsoft, by the service itself. And they come in various categories like quantities, like age, what the age of something, a numerical value, a percentage, currency, and so forth. So these are pre-built entities that you can define, or a timestamp or a date and time, an email, a phone number, a URL, and there are a few more that you'll see as we go through our lab demonstration here shortly. Now, some of those pre-configured ones that we talked about can be used for a lot of different technologies, not just for conversational understanding, which is what we're talking about now. They can be used for summarization, named entity recognition, PII detection, key phrase extraction, sentiment analysis, language detection, and so forth. And we've talked about some of these already in our videos, and we'll talk about other ones as we continue on in our training discussions here. Now, the learned features are the ones that the system will learn dynamically or that you have to label. So think about it this way. The pre-configured ones come pre-labeled, whereas the learned features, you specify the tagging or the labeling form to help identify what they are. And for those, we can use it for what we're discussing now, which is conversational language understanding. We can use it for custom named entity recognition, which will be, these will be our next few videos that we'll be doing, as well as our question and answer one, which is the previous video prior to this. So you can use that. So let's take a look at how this would work before we dive into our labs here shortly to demonstrate this. So I would submit a request into the service. So in this case, the request is, what is the time in Edinburgh? So that is the question. So in this case, the model says, okay, based on this time, we're doing a prediction here. We can determine that the intent is a time. Why? Because it says, what is the time? Now, the project kind that we have is going to be one of two options. Now, keep in mind, everything that you see here is our output. It's the output response to what we have based on this question here. So we're going to extract time. The project kind is either going to be orchestration or conversation, and we're doing conversational understanding right now, so it's conversational. And then we need to determine all the intent. So in this case, the top intent would be we're trying to get a time. So notice here, the intent is get time, and the system is 90% certain. This is always a percentage. So the system is 90% certain that the get time intent is the correct one. Now, that is not the only entity. So time is one of those, but we also have a location, which is Edinburgh. So if you notice here for our second entities, we have the name. What is it? It's a location. And then if you've watched the previous videos, we've talked about this. The offset defines exactly where in the request does this reside? So this is saying 18, which means if you count 18 spaces this way, it would start right there at the E. And then the length is the length of the word itself, which is 9. So this is just additional data. And the primary purpose of the offset and length is for you for troubleshooting and training purposes to make sure so you can understand exactly why the model is responding in the way that it is. What keywords in the request were used to process the request. So this is very important. So this is an example of how the output would look in this example here. So now the overall process that we would take for configuring this would be we would first define our utterances, our intents, and any entities that we want. So those would be the first steps. We call that building what's called the schema. So you define the schema. Once you've defined the schema, then what you need to do is you need to perform training. So you would initiate a training process to allow the model. It basically goes through using neural network technologies and it learns about the schema that you've defined. It looks at the utterance. It looks at the intent. It looks at the entities. And based off of that, it builds a model and learns from that. Once it's learned, it will then go through and test itself. It'll do either you can define the testing samples or the system will automatically test itself. And then it will generate a score. It'll actually generate 3 different scores for you. The scores are going to be called F1, recall, and precision. Those are the 3 scores that we have. Recall and precision, those 2 scores deal with the accuracy of the model itself. Each one identifies a separate component. F1 is basically an average of the recall and the precision. So you can look at the F1 by itself, or you can look at the recall and precision individually. It's up to you how you want to do that. But that'll tell you exactly how accurate the model is based on the test statements and test questions that it's had. And in our lab environment, in our demo, you'll see that. So once you're happy with the testing process and you're getting the results that you want, the level, the F1, the recall and precision scores are at the level that you want, then it's time to deploy the model. So you're going to go in there and deploy the model. When you deploy that model, it does generate an endpoint that all requests will go to. And then last but not least, once the models are deployed, which we don't list here, but you would then, from a programmatic standpoint, add that to your application code. So that is essentially conversational understanding. What we're going to do now is I'm going to do a quick demonstration showing you how this entire process is set up. And as we're going through it, I'm going to talk more about in detail a lot of the various options that we have as part of this here. So stay tuned here. Let's go ahead and jump right into the lab and take a look at it. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we can go in and configure what we just discussed in a lab environment. So let's kind of do a quick demo on how this works. So step one, in order to do any type of language understanding model, the first thing you need to do is create a resource. So we're going to go into our Azure environment here, and we're going to go and we're going to select the option for a language service. So we're going to create a brand new language service. Now, for this language service, what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to fill in all the pertinent information. Now, keep in mind, I've done this for the sake of simplicity and continuity, but I'm going to walk you through this process here. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in, select an option for a new language service. Because we want conversational language understanding, it's already one of our default features. So we're going to go ahead and create a resource here. We specify the subscription. We specify what resource group we want to create this in. We specify the geographical location, what region we want to deploy this in. We give it a name. We specify a pricing tier that we want to use. And we have to agree to the responsible AI requirements here. Outside of that, networking, identity tags, we're going to keep all of that with the defaults. And then you would select review and create. Now, once it's created, and it takes about a minute for that process to create, it'll show up here in your language service listing, which I have one called Convo Language Understanding as for our demo environment. So at this point, let's go ahead and take a look at this instance, because the important things that I need here are going to be the endpoint and one of my two keys, which we'll use when we get into the coding side of it, integrating with one of our applications. Now, once we've gone in and we've created the instance, the resource, then we're going to go to the Language Studio. Now, to get to the Language Studio, you can either go to the main overview page, and you can go here to kind of walk you through how to get there, or you can just go to language.cognitive.azure.com. So that is the URL that we would use for this to access it. Now, if this is the first time that you're connecting to this instance, you will get prompted, as you saw in one of our previous videos here. And it's going to ask you for what Azure Active Directory environment you want to use. It's going to ask you for your subscription, and then the resource type that we're going to specify. Now, I've already got mine configured here, but it would ask for your Azure AD environment, and it'll ask you for, here's my language understanding resource instance, which is essentially what we have here from the Azure portal. So I'm going to use that one in my example, which it currently is. It's my default configuration. Now, once that is completed, the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to create a new project. And what we're going to do is we're going to select the option for create a new conversational language understanding project. And in here, it's going to ask some key things. So you want to give it a name. And I've already got one pre-configured, but I'm going to walk you through this. You give it a name. You specify the primary language of the project. Now, this is useful if all the data is going to be and all the text is going to be in English, then you can use that, or whatever language that it's going to be processed in. If you have an instance where it may be different languages for different projects, then you can select this where it says enable multi-languages in the project. So now it can not just English, but it could be other languages. So I'm going to keep it in English for now, and then you would give it a description. So you put in a description for the project, select next, and then you would create it. All right, so here's kind of the work area for the project. So you notice here, the project name is right here, but you can also see the project name right here. By the way, you'll see the project name dash and then something else. That something else you see depends on which one of these screens you're in here, whichever one of these. So if I go to, let's say, data labeling, notice it says test dash data labeling. So that's what that is. All right, so the first thing that I'll need to do is, and we talked about this in the presentation, is I need to define essentially my utterance, the intent, and the intents. So those are important things. Now, for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to one that I already have pre-built to show you what it would look like, and I'll walk you through how to create it. So we would go to our schema definition. So notice here, I've switched over to the clock project, which you see here. If you remember from our video slide presentation, the first thing you need to do after you create your project is define the schema. And in your schema, you're going to define an intent. Now remember, an intent is basically what the model will use to determine what the request is, if it's a statement or a question and so forth. So you would add an intent. So you can give your intent a name. So let's say, to give you an example here, let's say weather. So we're going to say the weather is the name. And this is going to be kind of a cosmetic generic thing here. So and I've already got a few other ones, get date, get time, and so forth. So now that I've got my intent configured, now what we're going to do, and I've got some other ones listed here, as you can see, the next thing I need to do is I need to match the utterance, like the question someone would ask or the statement, to the intent. In order to do that, there's a few ways you can do it. You can click directly on one of these, or you can go over to your data labeling page. So if I go to my schema and click, let's say weather, here we go. So now I can go in and I can specify, we're going to do weather intents, and then I can go in and ask the question, what is the temperature today? So what this is what I'm putting in here is I'm telling the model, hey, these are examples of how someone may ask this type of question. So another one I could do is, if you think about, questions you would ask, let's go in here. Will the temp be tomorrow? I can go in there and say that, what was the temperature last week? You think about all the different ways that, and you don't have to create a lot of these, but you want a minimum of 15 for each one. And a minimum of 15 is just to give the model enough information to train on. That's the purpose of this here. So now you see I've got some questions about weather. I'm going to save these changes here so you can see over here on the right that it's been changed. So now, again, so notice here for weather, I've got 3 already set up. So let's go to our data labeling page, and you'll see there are my weather ones right here. But for the sake of this demonstration, I've created some other ones. Like I created an intent called get day, get time, get date. So I created 3 different ones. So for get day, okay, here's an example. You know what day it is. Get date, I said, okay, what was the date on this date? Get date. What date will it be on Friday? Get date. What day is it on Saturday? So I'm giving the model different examples on how to create these iterates. And all I do is I go in and I specify one of my intents and then type in a question. So I've got a few of them listed here already. So now, once you've got your labeling done in that case, the next thing we want to do is we want to map it back to something referred to as an entity. So to give you an example, so we're going to have our intent, which in this case is one of these categories here. That is going to tie back to an utterance. I'm just going to abbreviate this here, which is essentially a question related to the intent. And then finally, I'm going to list entities, which is what you see here. So this is the structure that we're going to define as part of this here. So let's go ahead and add an entity. And there are a few different types of entities that we can add. So I'm going to select add, and we're going to call this one, let's come up with a good one. Let's say temperature. I can spell temperature. So temperature. I think I spelled temperature wrong, but that's fine. So temperature. Now, how am I going to let the model determine temperature? The default option is learned, where the model will learn based on examples that I've provided and then give the temperature. But I can also say, you know what, instead of learning it, let's go ahead and create a list. So let's do a different one here just to make it fun. Let's add another definition here, and we're going to say state. So let's do state. So we're going to add the state entity. So now if I go to my data labeling, you'll see one here for, whoops, did I just do state? There it is right there. Where did my state go here? Oh, I did an entity. So let's do a little bit different here. So let's go in here. We're going to create let me remove this one here. Put it in the wrong spot. So let's create a new intent called state. So we're going to add this intent. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, just like we did for everything else, we're going to go into our labeling, and I'm going to pick state, and I'm going to say, what state do, so what is the capital of this state? And again, we're just providing examples of what it would be. What state is in the West, the US? So various questions that you want to put in here. There we go. All right, so I've defined some state fields. So let's go back in, let's save this. Now let's go back to our schema definition and let's add an entity for it. So the entity we're going to do is, and again, I'm going to call it the same thing just for simplicity's sake. You can call it whatever you want. And in here for the state, I can let the system learn it, or I can provide a list. So I'm going to create a list for the state field. By the way, it doesn't matter which one you select here. Must be unique. I'll just add an X in here. It doesn't matter what you select down here for these options because you'll see them a little bit later here. There we go. So there it is right there, my state entity. I told you before that you can let the system learn it automatically. I can do what's called pre-built, and what pre-built is, which you saw in the slides, let me show you what pre-built is. I'm going to add a new pre-built, and these are all the pre-built options that we have that Microsoft provides. So if you know if it's going to deal with URLs, you can select URL. If it deals with temperature, which is one of the other ones that I have, we can do temperature. If it's a numerical value like a percentage, if it's things like currency or a person's name or a geographical location. So we'll do geographical location as this. So, and I can add additional ones. So because it's a state, I may say geographical location. And let's see if there are any other ones in here that we have. Nope, that's it. So we'll do geographical location. So I can go in and say, okay, anything dealing with the state, allow the system to automatically identify based on geographical location. And this is going to be used for training. Now I can add, and I'm going to use this one here, but I can also create a regular expression. So I can have a different entity for using a regex if I want to. I can include a list. And let me give you some examples of what that would look like. So for location, which is one of the entities that I've created, it's configured to be learned. So it's going to automatically learn what that is. And you can tell right here. So for the location, the entity it's going to learn. I've got one here called weekday. So the days of the week, basically. This is going to be learned in a list. So let me show you how that would work. You would select add, type in weekday, and then down here select list, and then you would provide a list. Let me show you what that looks like. So I've already got it built, so let's go open it up here. So for weekday, if you go down here, I added a list. And for each one of these, I put, different ways that the day of the week can be written. Now, I will recommend, if you were doing this in the real world, put many different variations. Most people will put either Friday or FRI, but you may want to put in there FR, which doesn't happen often, but someone may do that. Sometimes people say Friday, FRIYAY, so you may want to put that in there, but you want to put in as many possible options that someone would type in during their request. So this is an example of a list option where you manually define the list that's going to be used here. So that's another option that you have. So the date one that I pre-built earlier. So for date, I selected pre-built, which you see here, and I added a new pre-built, and I selected the option for date. So if you go in here, you'll see there's a field for date in here somewhere. Right there, date time, right there. So I've selected that. And again, you can add additional ones. I can click add again and add additional options if I need to. So for the state, when I built the state one, I could have gone in here and let's say for my list, add a new list and put in, all 50 states, or maybe put all the capitals in there if I wanted to, tie back to a state capital and so forth. The purpose of adding entities is to better help the model provide responses. It's designed to better help the model also better understand the request. That's the primary purpose of this. So now I've got my intents, which is what we're trying to find. I've got my entities, which adds additional data to help the model learn. So how do I use this? Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our data labeling here. And for each of my sample questions that I have, I've already got it defined. If I go to my entities, I've got it defined to be learned. So most of these the model's going to learn it automatically. But it can also use pre-built lists and so forth to help it better fine tune it. So when I go back to my labeling for each of my intents here, so let me give you an example. So for weather, if I wanted to tag that, I can tag it with one of these options here. So I would actually, let's go ahead and add the weather one. So let's say weather temp. We're going to add this. Now we already have there is a pre-built one specifically for weather. So in my weather entity, I'm going to add a new pre-built, and let's find the weather one, quantity and temperature. So we're going to save that one. So now I've got an intent called weather temp. So when I go back to my labeling for my weather ones, what was the temperature last week? I can go in, notice this little bracket here. I can go in and highlight the word and say, you know what? That's going to tie back to weather and temperature. Same thing here. Now, obviously, I would probably pick a numerical value of some sort, but what you're doing here by highlighting these is you're helping the model better understand, where a word may show up within a question or a statement to help the model better learn. Let me give you an example here. Let's go further down here. For this one here, under get date, if you notice in my question, I actually put a date in there, an actual date. Now, the date doesn't really matter, but what matters is the fact that I went in and selected that this is a date. It's a pre-built entity in this case. Notice here, for get date, I went and said, you know what, Friday is going to be considered a weekday, which was a list. If you remember, we had a list of days there. I did Saturday also. Why did I do Saturday? Primary purpose of this is to give the model enough information to learn. Could I have just gone with just this one example here and then selected Friday here? So weekday, and not done the second line, the second question? Yes, but here's how you make your model better. In the first question, I put, what date will it be on Friday? So that's the first question. So Friday's at the end of the day, end of the question. Let's do another one here. So we're going to do a get date. And we're going to say Friday runs on what day this month or this week. So notice here in this one, it's still a get date, just like our Friday one down here. So notice here, it's get date. What date will it be Friday? But I put Friday at the end of the question in this scenario here. In this one here, I'm putting Friday at the beginning of the question. And what this is doing is it's telling the model that, hey, Friday may show up in a bunch of different places within the question, but here's what you want to look for. So we're helping the model train it. Let me give you an example. If I were to show you a picture of an orange, so let's say I had an orange sitting in my hand. Let's use that. Let's say I have an orange sitting in my hand, and I tell you this is an orange. In your mind, you visualize that orange sitting in my hand. But what if I showed you a picture, or what if I took you to an orange grove where there are thousands of trees with oranges hanging off of them? You may not know that that is also an orange. Why? Because the only reference you have is that one orange sitting in my hand. But if I were to say, hey, this thing sitting in my hand is an orange, let's go to an orange grove. Look at all of these things hanging off of these trees that are orange. Those are oranges. What if I show you a fruit basket with apples, oranges, bananas, and other things? That's an orange also. So what I'm doing is I'm teaching you that an orange can be in different locations, but it's still an orange. The same thing holds true with our models. You want to show the model different ways that the information can be shown in a statement or a question, so that way it better understands it. If I only had this example here and here, the model may say, oh, well, usually, the day will always be at the end of the sentence or the statement. But that's not always true. So you want to give it different ways of looking at it, like we have here, where it's at the beginning of the statement or maybe in the middle and so forth. So the purpose of intent, let's save this here. Let's wait for it to save. There we go. So the purpose of the intent is to allow you to tag words within statements to help better train your model. So now we've gone in, we've added a bunch of intents and then specific questions that go with the intents to give the model different ways of looking at the question to learn. We've tagged some of the questions with entities. So that way the model has a better way. And by the way, you want to, in our example here, we're using something very basic. In the real world, you're going to have a lot more than this in your list, because the more you have in here, the better the model can learn, the more fine-tuned the model will be. But once you're done, you would save it. And then the next thing you need to do is I've now gone in and defined everything that my model needs to know to learn. The schema, the intents, the entities. I've labeled it with sample questions or sample statements. So now we need to go in and train the model. So we're going to go in to our training jobs, and we're going to start a brand new training job. And do I want to train a new model or an existing one? Now, I've already got my model here called clock. So I'm just going to train the existing one. If this is the first time you're doing it, you would train a new model and you would give it a name. Or let's say I want to keep this version of clock, but I want to create a new training instance of clock. So I can, let's say, call this clock 2 and then train that. So now I would have 2 different training models. So, but for now, we're just going to overwrite the existing model that I have, the existing training that I have. And in my training mode, do I want the model to train automatically for free, which is standard training? Notice here, it's only available for English. If you have a model that requires training in multiple languages, then you need to go with the advanced training. Now, the next part we have is data splitting. And what this does is I can go in and either let the model pick how it's going to split it. So what's going to happen is it's going to take up some of that data in the training. And what we're talking about here, let me go back to show you here. So if we go back to our data labeling, we've got the training data, which is right here, all of this, but then we have this testing data. So when I go in to train the model, I can let the system automatically pull data from my training and for testing. Or I can manually do it. So we're just going to let the system take 80% of the data and use it for training. And then after it's learned, it's going to take the other 20% and test against it to see if it works properly. So we're going to go ahead and let this train. So now you'll see that training is in progress and it's running through here. You'll see it says training 100% complete. So it's learned. Now it's going to do the evaluation. It's going to test against that data. And this typically takes about a minute or so. Now, obviously, if you have a lot more data, this is going to take longer. This could take hours or even, it could take a day for it to fully train, even longer. But because we have a very small data set, it'll go very quickly here. Okay, so now you'll see that the training succeeded there. So it's showing me that the model has been trained. So once the model is trained, the next thing that I'll need to do is I'll need to go in there and do some testing. So I want to make sure that it's going to give me the right answers to questions or statements and so forth. So to do this, we're going to do a testing under testing deployments. So here's where you would specify. So in this case here, we're going to look at the production deployment name. So in order to do this, what you would do is you go to your deploying model and you would add a new deployment. And I've already got a deployment called production. That's where that's coming from. But if you wanted to, you can add a new one. So let's call this one prod 2, just for simplicity's sake. Actually, no, we'll overwrite the production one here. And then what do we want to do? We want to train our clock model. And what region? We pick the region, and we're going to go ahead and deploy it. All right, so our deployment is complete. Now, what I'm going to do now is I go to my testing deployments, and I'm going to go and select production, which is what I just deployed, and I would ask a question. So what is today's date? So I'm going to ask it, what is today's date? And I'm going to run it. Now, down here, you'll get your results. And this is very useful before you actually use it in your production environment. You want to make sure it's giving the right responses. So if you notice here, based on my question, and we're using my production deployment, which is right here, production, I asked the question, what is today's date? And here's my result. So the first thing it determined is, okay, what is the question here? What is it? What is the intent? And the intent is to get the day. Why? Because I asked for what today's date is. And the model is 95% confident that is what you're asking. Now, how does it know this also? Well, it used entity data. It used the pre-built date entity, and we're 100% confident that is exactly what they're asking for. So the model took this intent and this entity information to provide a response. And the goal of this is to see exactly what it is. And then down here at the bottom, it shows me exactly, based on what I asked, what is today's date, it identified based on my entity linking that that is a date. And it would provide a response for me. Now, the nice thing about this is if you dig into the raw data, the JSON format, you'll get a lot more information. Notice here, here's my question. What is today's date? Now, the system said the top intent basically is get day. Now, there are other things that the model identified. So if you notice here, get day, it's 95% certain, but it also said get date. But if you notice here, get date was just below that. So that's why this is the top intent, which you see right there. So it took that and used that in processing the request. Now, I've got other intents also, like get time. Well, it was about 84%, 85%. For the state, it's low. For weather, it's very low. For none, it's nothing. So it breaks down how it came about determining the best response. And then based off of that, for entities, it used the date pre-built one. And then this is where in the question or in the statement did the word today show up. So it was the eighth space or character in the question. And the word today is 5 digits long, 5 characters long, which is where that 5 comes into play. And we are 100%. So the confidence score is going to be between 0 and 1. We're 100% certain the model is that you're asking about a date. That is what this is looking for. And then it would provide responses based on that. So based off of this, I'm pretty confident that the response is pretty accurate. Now, there's another thing. So let's get out of this and let's get back to our deployment model. And we're going to look at production here, okay? And the URL, so you'll get a prediction URL. So this URL can be used in your application code if you need to. But remember I told you during our presentation that the model will also tell you how, during the training process, how accurate it is. So if you go to the option called Model Performance right here, which is still in beta, it's in preview. There's my model, clock. It gives me the score results. So in here, and I can change this up, let's say entities and intents. So based on the training of this model, there are 3 different scores. F1, precision, and recall, which you see right here. Let's talk about the difference between these and how to analyze these. We're going to come back to F1. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is precision, which is this one right here. Here's what this means. So let's say, I'm going to give you an example. During the testing and the training process of our model, the system, after it learned, it ran it through some test scenarios to see what the response was. So let's say hypothetically, in our scenario here, let's say this model dealt with diseases. We're testing the model to determine if patients have a disease or not, diagnosing diseases. So in this model, I have got 15 patients that we're going to test against. Out of those 15 patients, only 12, so this is my test group, only 12 of those patients actually have the disease that we're detecting. So we're going to call these positive, which means I have 3 that are negative. 12 plus 3 gives us our total 15. So what this is doing is it's using an average. It's determining that the model should have only came back with 12, but it came back with 15. So if you do the math between this, basically the formula would look like this: true positive divided by true positive plus our false positive. So basically, this is my true positive, which is 12, which goes up here, plus my true positive, which is 12, plus false positive, which is this number here. So it's 12 over 15. And if you do the math, it ends up being about 80%. So in that scenario, now ignore this. This is a totally different one. But that's what precision means. What we're looking at when we look at precision is based off of known accurate responses. When the model ran through a test, how many of those accurate responses did it have total? It should have only, in the scenario here, it should have only shown 12 accurate or 12 positive, but it came back and said 15 were positive. So we need to determine that accuracy level. So that is precision. Now, recall works a little bit different here. So recall is kind of more for what we normally see, which is, and I'll show you the formula for this. For recall, we'll do RC. Recall is basically true positives divided by true positives plus false positives. So that is the mathematical formula that we use. So in this scenario, so let's say in my test, again, ignore these numbers here. We're not using that for now. But let's go back to my disease example. So let's say we had a total of 20 cases that we're testing for diseases. Now, all 20 of those cases were positive. So we're going to call this true positive. Now, during the testing, the model identified 12 cases. So it was off by 8, if you will. Okay. So we're going to say 8 in this case here, false and negative, because they technically were positive, but it came back and said, hey, out of 20, only 12 were actually positive, when really all 20 were. So there were 8 cases that came up as negative that were actually positive. So if you put these numbers in here, so the total true positives will be 20. And then true positive, which is 20, plus, actually, I should do this. True positive, which is 20. And then down here, which is my total number, down here, this would be 12 plus, in this case, 8, which is 20. And actually, I got this backwards here. Forgive me. Let's get rid of this here. My true positive is 12. I've got my numbers backwards. And then my true positive, which is 12 here, plus the false positives, which is 8. that equals 20. So 12 over 20 equals roughly 60 something percent. So that is how those numbers are determined. So precision is basically, how many did it, out of all the cases, how many of those cases did it get accurate versus ones that they thought were correct, but it's not? And you saw the formula. For recall, we look at basically out of all the cases that should have been positive, how many did it actually determine were positive? So in that scenario, 60%. So that's where your precision and your recall scores come from. Now, because we have a precision number and a recall number, the F1 score is basically an average of the precision and recall. So your F1 score, so we'll say F1 equals, in this case, precision recall. So we'll say PR for precision recall, or I should say precision times recall, divided by precision plus recall equals our F1 score. And you multiply that, and it's, I forgot, and multiply that by 2. And that will equal your F1 score. Now, you don't have to know how to calculate this out there, but just to give you an example of behind the scenes and exactly how those numbers work. But if you want to find out, if you just want to look at one score, look at your F1 score, because that's going to be an average of both of these here in its calculation. So this is a great way to determine how accurate your model is. So just to recap, step 1, you create your language understanding resource instance in Azure. You then go to the Language Studio portal, so language.cognitive.azure.com. You go here. And within here, you're going to go in, you're going to create a new project, a conversational language project, which I've got one already. Once the project is created, now you need to start adding your data within here. So step 1 is you go into your schema and you define your intents and you define your entities. Well, you define your intents first. Once you've defined your intents, then you go to your data labeling and you generate your question and link it to your intent. So you select an intent and then you select a question. You write a question out. Once you've done that, then you go back to your entities and add your entities, and then go back and label each of your questions or statements, as you can see here with the underlined areas. All of this is designed to help train your model. Once you've got that completed, then you're going to go in and train the model. So you're going to start a training job. You're going to specify either a brand new model or overwrite one of your existing models, and you're going to let the training job complete. Now, let's go back in here. Once the training job completes, again, the time it takes to complete depends on a lot of factors, primarily how much data you have and if you're using like an advanced model training job. But once your training job state succeeded, then you're ready to deploy your model. So you're going to deploy it, which basically creates an endpoint for it. Once you've deployed your model, then you're going to go and test it to make sure it's accurate. If it is accurate, then you're good to go. If it's not accurate, you would go back to your labeling, maybe add additional questions or statements, maybe add some additional intents in here, add some entities, start doing more entity tagging in here, and then you would retrain it until finally you get these numbers exactly where you want them, these score numbers. So once you're done, you can test it to make sure, and once you're happy with that, then you would use it programmatically. So let's take a look at it from a programmatic standpoint on how we would make this work for an application. All right, so in our example here, I've got an application called basically a clock client here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. Let's get out of this here. All right, so now let's take a look at it from an application standpoint. So I've got an application called Clock Client here. And the first thing I'll need is I need to modify my app settings file. And in my app settings file, I'm going to define the endpoint. And if you remember, the endpoint is generated through the Azure portal. So for my instance here, there's my endpoint, and then I would specify one of my keys. And that's the first component that we have here. So there's the endpoint, and there's one of my two keys. Now for this client here, for this application, there is some coding that you'll need to do, just kind of a demo for it. By the way, for those that are interested in demoing this, you can go to https://github.com/Microsoft Learning/MS Learn/AI/language, and you can download the files that you need. So you do a git clone command and download the files, and they'll give you everything you have here. So within my program CS, the first thing I need to do is import my namespaces. So we're going to be using, in this case, Azure and Azure AI language conversation. So I would need to import my namespaces. I would then need to go in and do a .NET add package. So I need to add the Azure AI language.conversations package. So I would install that package. There we go. So once my package is successfully installed, there is some code that you'll need to add as part of this here. So one of the things you'll need to do is add the client code. This is going to be part of that wrapper that's used to submit the request. And this is going to make a connect to the endpoint URL using your credentials here and your key here to generate a request. Here we're going to get the user input. So if I were to do a .NET run, there you go. It's enter some text, and so that's what's going on here. It's waiting for me to generate some questions. So, what time is it? I can go in and ask that question, and it comes back and gives me the response, which we'll go through the response here in a second. So you put in the code that you need in order to generate this, and then down here at the bottom, here's an example of how this would work. I'm using a very basic console app to do this. So my question is, what time is it? Notice here it gives me the response back in a JSON format, but it gives me a lot of additional data. So in this case, it's a conversational result. Here's the question or the query that was made. The top intent is get time. The conversation, so it's either going to be conversation or orchestration. So for conversational language understanding, it'll be conversation. Again, just like you saw in our testing example, the highest score was get time at 95%. So that's what the model is going to use, and it shows you each of the other intents and what the scores for each one of those is. And here's my question, and there's my answer. All right, so here's another good example here. So I asked a second question. What is the temp today? So what is the temperature today? So in here, it comes in and says, okay, the highest score is weather, which is one of my intents here, or my my intents. So that's what it's going to use here. It did have a score of 65% for date and so forth. And then it would come back and we're looking for weather temp. It identifies exactly where in the statement it was, 100% certain that's what it asked for today. And then it would generate a question. Now, I would have to tie back to some weather information, but no, so try asking me for the time, the day, or the date, and so forth. So this is examples of how you can go in and generate an app and have that application use that model that you just created. So hopefully you enjoyed this demonstration here. Again, I'll put the link here. If you want to try this on your own, go to https://github.com/Microsoft Learning/MS Learn/AI/language. Using git clone, you can download clone the repository with all the demo files, and you can definitely play with it on your own if you want to and demonstrate and learn it. Hopefully you enjoyed this demonstration, and we'll be doing some more videos here. So I'll see you back for the next video. Thank you.